chapter 35 and 34, and we see that Jacob's boys took revenge against the Hittites that were nearby when the son of one of the leaders of the Hittites raped Dinah. But we need to understand that there's always consequences to things like that, and now God says to Jacob, you need to move, you need to leave. Jacob recognized that the people of the land were likely to try to take revenge against him, and therefore he was more than willing to do what God said, and that was to go back to Bethel, make an altar to God, get together his household and get rid of all of the idols that they had and put them, bury them under an oak tree in Shechem. And as Jacob travels, he is protected by God because of the incident that occurred with the Hittites. And when he is moving through the different towns, as he's moving back to Bethel, they're terrorized by the things that are accredited to Jacob's family. And so we find this protection that God provides as they travel. In verses 6 and 7 of chapter 35, we find that he settles in Luz, which is really Bethel, built an altar there, and something terrible happens. Deborah's, Rebecca's nurse, dies and is buried there. And we also find that God appears to Jacob and blesses him and reminds him of the promises he's made to Abraham and Isaac about the blessings and the lineage and all of the promises that he made. And he tells him, your name's going to be called Israel. Now that's the second time that he's told him that. First time he told him that was in chapter 32, verse 28. He renews this promise to Abraham and Isaac and reminds him of this name change. Another terrible thing happens, and that is Rachel dies in childbirth, giving birth to a son named Benjamin. And we find that that happens in Bethlehem. He puts a pillar over Rachel's grave, and we see this terrible thing happen. But there seems like lots of times terrible things happen in threes. And Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, born to Leah and Jacob, has a physical relationship with Bilhah, which is Rachel's maid. Now there's some real interesting applications if we look at the fact that God uses people in the scriptures to illustrate truths. We need to look at 5 truths that can come out of this particular section of scripture. First, we should always consider the potential consequences of any action that we take. We should think about revenge. We should think about various things that we can do and then the potential outcome of our actions. We need to remember that. I remember a number of years ago, a good friend of mine said, as I was getting ready to leave a company and join another company, don't burn your bridges behind you. In other words, don't tell off your old boss or tell him what a crummy company it was or whatever, but never burn your bridges behind you. And I think it's very wise for us always to remember for every action there is a reaction. That's not only scientific, but that's also true in human relations. And so we need to be sure that we consider the possible consequences of every action that we take, particularly in the area of revenge. The very few days go by when you don't read about somebody who gets mad in traffic, cuts off somebody else gets a gun out of the glove box. Next thing you know, somebody's dead. And so there's always potential consequences of particularly revenge. Second thing that I think is very worthy to look at when we think about this particular section of Scripture is God's protection of Jacob. God uses a lot of different ways to protect us, and he did here with Jacob, and the fact that Jacob's family had slaughtered the Hittites, and now he was being protected by the misconduct of his boys. But God can use whatever he needs to use in order to accomplish his will. Thirdly, I think that God took a note of Deborah. And even though she was just a nurse to Rebekah, God makes special note of Deborah. Now, we don't know a lot of other things about Deborah, but we do notice that God takes note of her. And I think it's important for us to realize that we're all important in God's eyes. He knows all about us, about every hair on our head. Then, fourthly, I think it's important that we recognize that when Rachel dies, remember this is the one that Jacob loved more than any of his other wives or concubines. When she dies in childbirth, it's another bad thing that happens in Jacob's life. God never promised us that life was going to be easy. Never promised us we wouldn't have trouble. Never promised us we wouldn't lose somebody we loved. Never promised us that we would have perfect health or wealth. And I think it's important for us to remember that he didn't with the people in the scriptures that are listed there. They all had their problems. They all had their difficulties. And then finally, I think number 5, we have the rebellious children. We have the firstborn of Jacob and Leah, who commits a vile act of having a physical relationship with Bilhah. And obviously by this time he is an adult, and yet he does something very vile and disgraces his father with this action of his. And again, I think we need to remember that we can do all we can when our children are under our roof to try to keep them out of trouble and to respect authority and so on. But God gave every person free will, and that goes to children and any age. Rebellious 2-year-old, rebellious 12-year-old, rebellious 22-year-old, rebellious 30-year-old. God holds each of us accountable for our actions, but he does hold us accountable for doing the very best we can in bringing them up. So a lot of good lessons from today's section of Scripture, just 20 or 30 verses here. And then we find the summary of the lineage of Jacob in verses 23 through 26. So if you have trouble remembering who's who, you'll find there a good reminder of what children belong to which women, and were Jacob's children, and how we arrived at the 12 tribes of Israel. And then there's a final reminder in this section of Scripture about the fact that Isaac lived 180 years. But there's something else significant besides the number of years that he lived. It says that Esau and Jacob buried him. So even though they had their conflicts, even though they had their differences, and even though they weren't best of friends and close brothers, we do find that they worked together in respect to honoring their father, Isaac. And that's my thought for the day. It's a lot of lessons, isn't there? So much that we can learn from God's scriptures. So many lessons that he teaches us that are played out in all of the lives of the people of the scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament. God bless you and have a great day.